Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far that we are premiering live on YouTube. For this technical presentation, the Geotechnical Institute, we have Ramanuja Kannan, or RC. RC joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Fort Worth District, in 2009 and currently serves as Geotechnical Engineering Specialist. His expertise include dam and levee safety, instrumentation, foundation design, and marine civil engineering. His current assignments include a number of civil work feasibilities studies and military construction. He is a subject matter expert on karst with the geology community of practice of USACE. So please help me welcome RC Kannan. Thank you.
Morning to you all, members and guests as well. Thank you for this opportunity to present this report card to you. My name is R.C. Cannon. I've been a member of ASCE since 1972. I'm currently a fellow, and I've been involved in a few technical committees with ASCE before. And in fact, I was involved in one of the report cards in Florida a long time ago in 2008. So these report cards are personal favorites of mine to share with everybody. One small disclaimer, though I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, and there are a few slides here that are very relevant to the Corps' activities, I don't represent the Army Corps of Engineers in this presentation, nor the ASCE, because there are a few additional slides that I put in there, but I have included reference to those sources. As you said, back in 2013, one of the things that the report concluded was, you see on the right-hand side here, by investing about $157 billion per year through the year 2020, which was last year, we could have prevented $3.1 trillion loss in GDP, about 3.5 million job losses, 2.4 trillion in consumer spending, and et cetera, et cetera. The point was that at that point, the funding gap was $1.6 trillion at the current level in 2013. That, if you don't invest that $1.1 trillion more at that time, by 2020, the funding gap would have been $2.75 trillion. And we are pretty close to that figure, and these estimates are not just numbers, they are real figures. One of the things that we can see about investment in infrastructure was really demonstrated to us during what we call as the ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was passed in 2009, by putting in about $830 billion into the economy, which included a lot of other things besides just bridges and roads and all, airports and etc. The funding for the so-called infrastructure element, which most people understand to be kind of hardware, was about $350 billion. And you can see the amount of improvement that we could manage with that money. On the right-hand side, what we have was an estimated 10-year infrastructure spending gap. In other words, even though we put in $350 billion in the infrastructure directly into roads and bridges and ports and airports, it was still a shortage of $2.1 trillion at that time. Going to the next slide, you can see the gap between the estimated funding and the funding gap. Of course, this is just another way of looking at the same figure, that we are not putting in enough funding in what we need. And the reason for investment spending in infrastructure is very comically illustrated in this photograph. This is the Greenfield Bridge in Pittsburgh, which you see a bridge and a bridge underneath the bridge over the Interstate Highway 376. This bridge was built to catch the debris falling from this bridge because of the deterioration in there. Of course, this bridge was imploded and a new bridge was built at a cost of, I believe, $175 million. I may be wrong on that one, but we can check the figures. But the new bridge is pretty much architecturally very similar to the old bridge and much appreciated by the communities that are using this bridge every day. Another example, very recent one from the I-40 bridge in Memphis, between Memphis and Arkansas. It is now under repair and probably will be open for traffic, but perhaps lighter traffic, I'm not sure. And when you go to the so-called report card, we talk about the condition of bridges and roads, etc., on what you saw in the two slides before. How is the report card done, or the methodology of the report card? These are the factors that we look into: the capacity, the condition, the funding, future need, operation and maintenance, public safety, and so on. All of these figures are put together by collecting information from both public and private sources, municipalities, and categorize them in different infrastructure elements, such as roads, bridges, airports, ports, whatever. Now, what do these grades mean? A means it is fit for the future. The element that we have is doing fine, no problems, that is being maintained properly. It'll take us into the future. B means it is just good enough for what we have today. As the traffic grows, it's not going to hold up. C means it is already requiring attention now. Something needs to be done to fix it. Perhaps in a case like a road or a turnpike, you may need more roads, whatever. And D means it is already at risk. F, of course, it fails. Now, this is the overall report card and where we stand with all these. Aviation, of course, got a D+. There was a small improvement from D last year, our last report. And so on it goes, and you can see the whole bunch of C's and D's. Ports went from C to B-, and of course, bridges went from C+ to a C in the last two reports. What are the trends? I mean, what is it that it is making this funding necessary and the condition of the infrastructure to be in a shape that it is now? First one is maintenance backlogs. There isn't enough money for maintaining everything, and we do maintain only by prioritizing what is failing today, tomorrow, or even after it fails. The second point is that the federal spending on many of these issues have gone down during the years, and state funding hasn't kept up with it. Local governments, of course, struggle to keep things moving. And the third factor is that some of the data that we have is unreliable. In other words, it's not complete, not that it is wrong. It is either not enough or there are some data gaps. Now, looking at each one of these, we have specific issues with what roads, condition of the roads, condition of the bridges and all that. Let me go briefly over each one of these. As I look at my notes here. Okay, road work is frequently underfunded, as you know, and over 40% of the system is in poor or mediocre condition. And this is a fact that we just have to wake up to, and that is 36,000 people die on the nation's road every year, and that includes the pedestrian fatalities also. When it comes to bridges, 42% of all bridges are at least 50 years old, with an average age is 44 years. There are 178 million trips a day, and not just on all the bridges, on structurally deficient bridges like the one you saw in Memphis. For the first time since 2019, the number of bridges in fair condition exceeded the number of bridges in good condition. And when it comes to aviation, of course, the grade is D. Last year, of course, we saw a lot, considerably reduced traffic that kind of helped to keep the infrastructure in somewhat of a good shape, but there is still $111 billion shortfall in the budgets for aviation. The transit facilities, of course, again, suffered the similar fate last year, but then we have to bring it back into shape this year. Going into the other aspects of the infrastructure, like drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater, we have about 2.2 million miles of underground pipes. Of course, we saw that maybe the other day in the news, you have one pipe break or something. So that needs about billions of gallons of water to be treated, and it's being lost actually to accidents like this. Wastewater, about 81% of the wastewater treatment plants have reached or exceeded their capacities. And many of the treatment plants or in their networks are approaching their end of their lifespan. And the last year, there were about $3 billion spent, I think not last year, 2019. And that gave us about 4,700 more miles of sewer pipes. And stormwater suffers a similar fate. We lose about $9 billion due to flooding every year. And federal funding has gone up by about $250 million, but that's, as you know, still not enough. Going into the next one, which is dams and levees. There are a couple of slides here that I went into amplifying a little bit for the benefit of my colleagues at the Army Corps. We will look at that in a little detail. There are 91,000 dams in the inventory that ASCE looked at. 81% had an emergency action plan. Now remember, the emergency action plan is not a solution to anything. It is just a plan to react. And of course, as you see more of the numbers here, about 4.7% of these dams are owned by federal government, and 42 of those fall under either USAID or BUREC. And that's about 783 dams. And if you include all the dams that we have in the inventory that are controlled by state or federal government, ASCE, which is the American State Dam Safety Officials, estimate that we need $27.6 billion on that one. Now, there are federal programs which fund the dam safety program, and about 100 million was allotted in 2019. Oddly, only 12 million of that was actually funded, which is called as appropriated. Going into levees, a similar situation. There are 30,000 miles of levees that we have documented. And if you look at the box here, the National Levee Safety Program expects that it needs $79 million a year to document the condition of the levees in the National Levee Database. Now, remember, this is just the documentation. That means go to each levee, look at it, document it, take pictures, keep a record, and what we call as a baseline information on these levees. That is $79 million a year. Of course, we don't have that kind of a funding. Going into inland waterways and rail and ports, we have a similar picture. There is a statistic that I looked at way back when I did a report on the ports. In order to transport something by road, rail, or barge, the figures are somewhat like this. The figures that are not passed on to the consumer. If you ship something by rail, the cost savings is about 6 times as compared to truck traffic. Whereas if you ship that by barge, it's about 9 times that of truck traffic. Now, we looked at roads and bridges and all that where, like I said, 178 million crossings every day. But a lot of this stuff goes through ports and trains, freight trains. About $6.8 billion worth of backlog in construction projects are there in waterways alone. And in ports, we have about 300 different ports, both small and big. And out of that, only about 10 or less have the facility to accommodate what we call the Panamax and the QMax ships. These are the huge ships like 300,000 TEUs and so on. We really don't have the capacity on many of our ports to handle some of the bigger containers. Going into the next one, we have solid waste, hazardous waste, and energy infrastructure. Now, when it comes to solid waste, once again, most of it goes to the landfills, as you know. And we are generating about 4.5 pounds of garbage every day, every person. And 53% of that goes to landfills, about 13% gets composted. Hazardous waste in a similar situation, there were 35 million tons of hazardous material. And around 60% of the non-federal Superfund sites are in areas where the pollution for potential is so high that it will affect the stormwater, wildfire, sea level, and so on. Coming to the energy sector, we have seen that the interruption caused by severe weather, and we also need a better power grid. Also, the distribution structure is vulnerable to other things such as cyber attacks. Parks, recreation, and schools. We don't pay much attention to these little things, but since most people couldn't go to the parks last year, they all flooded the parks this year, and some of the parks had to close to visitors because the facilities are just not enough. Likewise, schools, of course, many of the schools still have portable buildings. School buses need to be refurbished and put back in service. There are a lot of infrastructure needs that we are not meeting yet. Looking at what our infrastructure investment needs are. Now, remember I showed earlier in a slide that we need about $2.2 trillion at the 2013 funding levels. Well, the estimate has improved a little bit to $2.59 trillion. And here's a breakdown by particular area of infrastructure and the total funding gap, which now stands at $2.59 trillion. What ASCE recommends has always recommended to overcome this problem is leadership and action, investment in infrastructure, and building resilience. When it comes to these simple facts, of course, you know that it falls on all of us to do something about it. Now, last year was due to the pandemic, things were slow and we had time to clean up some of these things. But then what is the consequence of failing to do what these figures mean? These are some things that ASCE put together by actual numbers of losses versus what actually it means to personal losses to people. The average American household loses $63 a week due to chronic underinvestment in infrastructure. Okay, what can you buy with $63 a week or $275 a month? A takeout dinner for a family for four for each week, starting a college fund, home repairs. And looking at the left-hand side of the slide, the average American household will spend $3,300 a year due to infrastructure deficiencies. How does that number come from? Due to the loss of time, hitting a pothole, having to fix your car, whatever. These are directly things that impact us. Along with this so-called report card, ASCE also puts out what they call as a failure to act. Now this tells us, okay, we told you we need $2.59 trillion. What happens if you don't invest all of that money? Of course, we know that we're going to have some shortage in funding, but what are the consequences of not spending that money? Well, for example, the disposable income will drop by about 4% for every individual. This is by between now and 2039. We are looking at a 20-year frame with a baseline of 2019. Now, some of these figures will be easy to look at but hard to read. I'm not going to go into reading this slide, but what it says here is about two different figures that I'll show you in the next two slides. One is the gap between the funding and the gap, the actual funding needed. Say, for example, if you take electricity, by in the period 2020 to 2029, there will be a 70% shortage of funding. Or in other words, of the total needs, we will get only 70%. Electricity in the years between 2030 and 39 will be 80% shortage. I mean, the gap between what is needed and what is provided. You can imagine what happens when you lose about 20% of the funding in any one part of infrastructure. Now, this kind of summarizes the funding gap between 2020 and 29 and 20 and 39 for the 10-year period and the 20-year period. Now, what will happen is the total comes to about close to $6 trillion, and split between how it affects individual families. The figures are the first 10 years will be average of $1,500. The next 10 years it will be $5,400, or if you average it over the 20-year period, it's about $3,300 per family. Well, what does it mean when you say the funding gap or the loss of income to families or loss of disposable income? This is what happens. Services get hit. People don't go for things that they used to go to. They stop buying durable goods or waiting and postponing it until it breaks down. Non-durable goods, such as computers and so on, which people like to replace every 3 to 5 years, will have to wait a little longer. So this is the basic impact on what happens when personal consumption drops. And according to this estimate, there will be a total of $8.9 trillion decline in personal consumption. Well, looking at the same thing in another way, but grouping some other substances into this analysis, the business sales is estimated at $18 trillion in the 10 years. I'm sorry, 20 years. The gross GDP, which you saw in the previous slide, will be about $8.1 trillion. Disposable income that people can spend will go down by $7 trillion. Now, some of these numbers may not add up exactly because of the rounding, but if you look at the trade effects, I mean, it's not just a question of people losing money or the infrastructure spending having bigger and bigger funding gaps. The cumulative loss in trade is also estimated to be about $4 trillion for the total decrease during that 20-year period. There's a question on what does it benefit to invest in infrastructure or spending money. I mean, we are always talking about spending waste and cutting down spending, and there's always a personal as well as a national kind of animosity against spending more. I mean, we always get into so-called deficit spending, trade deficit, and so on. But these are figures put down by an economist who testified before Congress on what the benefits of spending are. For example, if you provide people money for food stamps or increase the funding on food stamps, for every dollar that you give, you get a return into GDP of $1.72. Now, how does this work? You get money for food stamps, you go and spend it on, let's say, beer and potato chips, which you probably wouldn't buy otherwise. That produces more demand for these goods. People get to work, more is produced, and the economy grows as the beer comes in trucks and the supermarkets start storing them, hiring people. So there is a $1.72 of money put back into the economy for every dollar that you give to people to spend on food and the basic necessities. Go down the list, of course, some of these things are not that popular, which is the across the board tax cut. The tax cut doesn't produce as much of a return as you can see in the other ones, because it's not the money that you really see, it's the money that you don't pay. So every dollar tax cut that you get only puts in about another 3 cents more into the GDP. Now, look at the other figures, the infrastructure spending. For example, we looked at the ARRA funding in 2009-2010. The job growth that it created at the time went on and on for years, and even until now. So when you put money into infrastructure spending, every dollar that you put in brings in $1.57 of growth in the GDP. Same thing with the central and state government aid. Give money to the state, they put it not only just on bridges and roads, but they also on keeping the police paid and building better parks. All of those things add up to value in the economy. Now, recently we talked all about this so-called the American Jobs Plan, or what was put out by the White House at $2.2 trillion, which was promptly rejected. And so they went back to the board and trimmed it a little. Now, some of these figures are disputable, what you can say. Some people don't think that uh, providing money for quality of life at home or providing childcare is a waste of money and not an infrastructure element. Or they even say, oh, well, paying people for getting training is not infrastructure, or refurbishing federal buildings with better air conditioning is not infrastructure. Putting money into housing and making apartments affordable is not infrastructure. They want money only for roads and bridges or airports and ports and whatever. So this added up to $2.2 trillion, which didn't work out. And I had to break it down for our colleagues at the Army Corps to see what exactly out of that $621 billion will come towards projects that are directly associated with the Army Corps, and that was $331 billion. And the next slide is a question of where the money will come from. At that time, the proposal put forward by the president was collect more taxes. Now, some of these taxes are disputable, and for example, the fossil fuel subsidies, the money that we give to Exxon and Chevron and so on, about $25 billion, and they make about $1 to $3 billion profit every year. Or the global minimum tax, which was kind of approved and accepted by all the G20 countries, or G7 first and then the G20. The one on foreign derived intangible income, which means the money that multinational corporations put away in foreign countries and not pay taxes on them. The proposal is to bring them back in. And the corporations are sitting on $4.1 trillion of money that they have not invested either in their own corporations or in the infrastructure. Most of that money is just used to buy back their own stocks so the value of their shares go up. That's my personal opinion. Now, the recent bipartisan framework looks like this, which transportation gets about $312 billion. Other infrastructure gets about $266 billion. And this is not all new taxes or anything. It is just shifting money from various sources. Now, of course, a lot of this goes into roads, bridges, ports, airways, and the EVs, electric vehicles, and so on. And also broadband, Wi-Fi infrastructure, environmental remediation, resilience, which is one of the most important things, that is to deal with changes imposed by climate change and cyber attacks and so on. So where does this money come from? Mostly from closing the tax gap, redirecting unspent emergency relief funds, and targeted corporate users fees, and the so-called macroeconomic impact of infrastructure element. Now, some of this you probably understand as private-public partnerships or private activity bonds and so on. Say, this has been done in public-private partnership in a very big way. For example, Mitsubishi invested in a port improvement in Jacksonville because of the facilities that they wanted to use. Private roads, which are open to public, are done by some of the major warehousing operations because they just need an exit from interstate so to reach their warehouse. So that helps everybody else. So they invest in that infrastructure and so on. And so there are possible ways of funding it. And of course, all of this will go into discussion in Congress. Briefly, to go back into what is happening in Texas. Now, we have the overall GPA of C. As you can see, most of this are B, C, and D, but obviously Texas airports should get a good grade with a B minus. Highways and roads, of course, we spend so much money on it, but we are still on a D or D plus. About 1 in 3 of the state dams are at flood risk mitigation. And the funny thing about Texas is that there are 3,200 dams in Texas, that are exempt from state requirements by legislation. That means they don't have to do anything to repair anything if they are right now, unless they fail. We need about $2.1 billion in Texas for this rehabilitation of small dams. That brings us to the end of this presentation. Of course, I will have a lot of questions, and we had a lot of billions, trillions, and a lot of it doesn't make sense unless we actually see the money pour into the economy. And you all know that when you have a better road, a better facility, we all enjoy it. For example, we have high-speed trains running about 80 miles per hour, I believe, maybe 100 in some sectors. Most of the rest of the world runs trains at 320 kilometers per hour, which is 180 miles per hour. Now, may not be everybody's cup of tea, but look at the benefits of what we do. I mean, you're all engineers. You're the ones who are going to shape the future. My final thing is, what can you do about it? Well, look at the report, read it for yourself, call your congressman or your senator, push for the project that you like. At least they need to know that they want to hear from you. There is an aspect of ASCE called Key Contact. You can sign up, and they will send you actual figures and facts on what's being discussed in the Senate and Congress. And you can take particular action on particular issues if you like. So with that, I will close this. And of course, I couldn't be here with you in person. I will take any questions by chat and try to answer them as much as you can. Thank you very much, and have a good day.